for World Social Work Day 2022 is Co-Building a New Eco-Social World, Leaving No One Behind. This reflects a vision of new global values, policies and practices, as well as the sustainability of the planet. World Social Work Day 2022 is an opportunity for the social work profession to think how they can engage networks in the community we work within to make contributions to the values and principles which enable all people to have their dignity respected through shared futures. And I'll be putting in the chat in a minute a link to the new Eco-Social World website, which is a forum where you will see debates and papers from social workers discussing ethics and values. And it's very interesting. I'll put that in the chat later. So the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust and the British Association of Social Workers, BASWA, are proud to stand together with social workers across the world to mark World Social Work Day. This lunchtime event, entitled Unequal Impact, the links between environment, racism and climate change, will examine the connections between those who profit from racism, colonialism and exploitation, and those who cause and profit from the destruction of the world's natural resources from a UK perspective. We will conclude by asking, how do we co-build a new eco-social world where no one is left behind? After the presentations, we'll invite questions from the audience. The chat function will be closed until the Q&A is at the end. And also then there'll be a survey placed in the chat for you to complete before the end of the meeting. And we'd be grateful if you could do that. So today we have two speakers who we're very lucky to have join us today to give their papers. We have Chantal Thomas, who is the anti-racism lead at BASWA UK and the course lead for the MA in Social Work programme at the Tavistock and Portman. Chantal is a qualified social worker, senior academic and doctoral researcher interested in anti-racist leadership in social work. Her role involves working collaboratively with members, colleagues and senior stakeholders to support the delivery of BASWA's equality, diversity and inclusion strategy, alongside exploring how anti-racist practice can be developed and implemented across the social work sector. We also have Anna Harvey, who's a senior lecturer in social work at the Tavistock and Portman. Anna has taught on the professional doctorate in social work and the MA in social work for the past 6 years. She's a children and family social worker who qualified 25 years ago. She worked with homeless people in therapeutic communities in Glasgow for 7 years prior to qualifying. Her original degree was in political philosophy and developmental politics, and this is where she learned about colonialism and exploitation. She recently became aware of the threat to children and families from ecological and climate disaster and began addressing the issues from a psychosocial perspective. She's interested in developing the dialogue about climate change within the social work profession in the UK. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Chantal to start.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Steve, for that lovely introduction. And just good afternoon, everybody, and welcome. Happy World Social Work Day to all my fellow social workers. And if you're not a social worker, that's still fine. We love you anyway. Okay, right, let me share my screen. Here we go. Right, can everybody see my slides? Yep, perfect, excellent. Okay, right, okay. So yeah, I'm gonna do the first part of this talk. Please, I do have a tendency to go over time. So if you see me getting past my 20 minutes, Anna or Steve, please, give me a shout. All right, great stuff. Let's kick off, right. Unequal impact, the link between climate change and racial justice, or I put racial injustice because, well, that would become obvious. The extreme weathers of last summer has shown us that climate change can affect anybody across the world. That we've seen not just last summer, but I'll probably say the last over the last kind of 10 years or so. You know, the summers are getting warmer, the winters are getting colder. And we're seeing, I remember there was one year where we had kind of 3 or 4, you know, different seasons all in one day. You know, the world is breaking down. As I said, the effects of climate change can be seen anywhere. The Arctic and Antarctica is melting. This is causing rising sea levels. The frequency and the strength of storms are increasing. And this is leaving destruction, you know, in its wake. The rainfall patterns are shifting, and this is causing devastating droughts and floods. As our climate breaks down, billions of people are already struggling to cope, and it's usually the poorest people that are hit the worst by climate change effects. Powerful cyclones have devastated the lives of millions of people in the Philippines. Forest fires across Russia and Europe have covered the cities in thick pollutants in smoke. You remember that you know, that year when we had that big thick smog, the ash cloud and everything else. You know, the signs have been evident, you know, for a number of years. And closer to home, you know, we had the floods, the catastrophic floods that turned lives upside down in Yorkshire, Cumbria, and in Somerset as well. Sorry, let me change that. So that's just my pictures of climate change. So I should put that one on before. In dry conditions, wildfires rage out of control, reducing mighty forests to ash. The oceans are warming up, the water is becoming more acidic, causing a lot of corals to die, and this is causing a loss to the breeding grounds of sea creatures. Ecosystems, homes, you know, to our insects, plants, animals are struggling to adapt quickly enough to the climate change. And this is causing really, you know, massive problems to food security, health, and the quality of life is all, you know, under threat. The state of the climate and the health of our planet are ultimately linked. You know, one radically affects the other. But I think the important fact that we cannot ignore, that those who are and continue to be at the front line of climate change disasters are usually Black people, Black and brown people, people of color, Indigenous people. We can use whatever term you want within reason, except the term BAME. I don't like that term. Actually, I hate that term, but that's a conversation for another day. Statistically speaking, people of color, Black people, brown people, as I mentioned, are at the catastrophic end, always, you know, seem to experience these disasters at the worst end, you know, and this will continue as the crisis intensifies. This picture I've got up now is of Hurricane Katrina. And why I've used that picture, I think it really highlights, that was in 2005. And Hurricane Katrina, 80% of the people who lost their homes were Black people. Over half the fatalities of Hurricane Katrina were Black people. The initial plans to regenerate and to rebuild Hurricane Katrina and New Orleans were the privileged white people. How does that match up? How does that balance? How is that fair? Subsequent hurricanes have exemplified the racial disparities in disaster management and aid recovery. Insurance and prioritizations of Black people is significantly less. And also, we are less likely to have access to household and business recovery and insurances and things like that. The global movement to support Black rights, Black Lives Matter movement, and why some people may not, you know, subscribe to the organization. I'm talking about more the movement and the movement for change. What BLM did was highlight systemic and institutional racism. And it was kind of, you know, based around, you know, the murders, you know, at the hands of the police. But it helped, and it highlighted, particularly, you know, over 2020 with the George Floyd murder. It really brought that to the fore, you know, that Black lives seem to matter less than others. And when you look at those that are affected by the environment and the crisis in which we're suffering, it's Black people. Sorry, my mouse has gone astray. Oh, here we go. So what does race have to do with climate change? Everything. Who knew? This was a revelation to me, until quite recently, actually. And I know that may seem really strange. It was through a conversation with my colleague, Anna Harvey, who does a lot of work around climate change. And I started to really make the links. And I think the more I researched, the more I looked and, really interrogated, the research around environmental racism, the more I thought, how could I not know this? In any crisis, it's the poorest and the most vulnerable that suffer the greatest impact. And this has even been more telling, even recently, looking at the deaths due to coronavirus, where Black and Asian people were dying at a much more disproportionately higher rate than their white counterparts. The impacts of the pandemic have laid bare the striking inequalities in the UK and across the world, and its racist dimensions. Two members of Black Lives Matter, the movement, coined it, summed up, this epidemic. Racism is endemic to global inequality. This means that those that are affected and ultimately killed by climate change are Black and poor people. It's for this reason that there are calls now being made for to center racial equity and justice in seeking meaningful solutions to climate change. So we can't look at one without the other. They're inextricably linked. They're intertwined. There is definitely a cause and effect. Oops, where have we gone? Let's go back. Oops, wrong way. So this little infographic, it just kind of explains the dimensions of environmental racism. Now, anybody who's heard me speak before around, in my role with BASWELL, when I'm talking to universities or, social work leaders around institutional racism, I use an infographic pretty similar to this one. So when I saw this one around environmental racism, it just, again, made the link so obvious that racism is racism, environmental, institutional, whatever type of racism, there always seems to be these four different stages to it. The interpersonal level, that's just one-on-one, somebody makes a comment to you or has a particular view of you. Institutions, that's when it's, cultural, it's embedded in systems, it's the power, it's the privilege, Same with structural, again, it's the foundation. And if you look at how it's pictured in the diagram, again, I think it's just such a powerful image to help people to understand, when we talk about the different levels of racism and internalize, it's when we begin to think as society is portraying us, we begin to internalize the messages, the negative stereotypes, and begin to act as if, what is saying about us is true. The direct links between environmental racism and racial justice have long been areas of research and activism, and the relationship between climate change and racial justice builds on these connections. As I mentioned, there's been long-standing racist policies and practices around, segregation in terms of postcodes and addresses, England, America, across the world. Unequal educational opportunities. We know in the UK, our Black children are 10 times more likely, particularly boys, to be excluded from school. We have the issues around health inequalities. A Black woman is 5 times more likely to die during childbirth or within the first year of pregnancy. We've got the prison populations, we've got mental health, the stats are out there. And again, it's about understanding how it all links. And as I said, all these disproportions have led to the increase and the vulnerability in Black people to climate change impacts, and by extension, other forms of global crises that may emerge. The bigger picture, there was on average one climate disaster crisis occurring worldwide every week. This is called into the UN. Most of those are happening in what is known as the global south. So this is what, it's referred to kind of the underdeveloped countries. The climate crisis is rarely mentioned as a cause for these disasters when they're reported. But in truth, the extreme weather events are getting more frequent and more intense, as I kind of mentioned at the beginning. Our climate is breaking down. But here's the real injustice. The people that are most affected are also much less likely to have contributed to the problem in the first place. Some Oxfam stats for you. Someone in the UK will take just 5 days to emit the same carbon as someone in Rwanda does in the entire year. 5 days, 1 year. Look at that. By the 12th of January every year, the average Brit's emissions will have overtaken the annual per capita emission of a further 6 African countries: Malawi, Ethiopia, Uganda, Madagascar, Guinea, and Burkina Faso. I'm going to repeat that. By the 12th of January every year, the average Brit's emission will be overtaken annual per capita emission of a further 6 African countries. I want people just think about that for a moment, because that was quite striking. And I was having a conversation with my colleague, Anna, just before we came in. And I was just saying, as I said at the beginning, I hadn't really made the connections. And I think the more I've been, getting into this and the more I've been researching, it's just, yeah, it's heartbreaking, to be honest. It really, it's the impact. And as I said, I hadn't made the connections before. Why is this happening? Now, corporations and governments in the global north, so these are the Western countries, the UK, well, Europe as a whole, America, South Asia, the developed, so-called developed countries, have long been and continue to be responsible for Black people paying the prices for climate emergency. The inequality is down to racism, and this racism goes back to hundreds of years. Many countries in the global south have long histories of colonial rule. During which time their resources, land, labor were stolen by European colonialists. Thriving societies and economies across South America, Africa, and Asia were reshaped to benefit European empires. The legacy of colonialism are still alive and well today. So let's not get this thing twisted. It's still, it's still ever present. Global trade systems are set up to favor Western countries, and multinational corporations continue to exploit the environment of the global south through fast fashion and extractive mining. Now, I've got the example here of bauxite mining in Jamaica. So Jamaica is where my family are from. And I remember seeing, my granddad lives up in the hills in the countryside. And, it's called bauxite. That's the general term for it, but we call it red dirt because it's basically red. But it's very mineral. It's very high in aluminium. So what happens is, particularly in Jamaica, it's the US that predominantly benefit from the red dirt. So it's dug up, it's carried to the ports, and it's shipped away. So as it says, it's very high in aluminium. It's one of the world's, the main source of aluminium. The impact on the environment, the impact on the local community. So for one, Jamaicans don't benefit from the profit. Also, in terms of the dust, the noise, the smell, it's very detrimental on the local people. Also, in relation to breaking down the country, as you can see, the bottom right-hand picture shows the green, the green of the country, and then you've got the red, which is the red dirt, which is dug up, and that leaves a lot of the plantations and the vegetation kind of open and unable to be be used or anything else to be grown on that once they've taken out the nutrients out of that soil. So Jamaica was once the biggest producers of bauxite until recently. It's now been surpassed by Australia. And I mentioned the US makes the biggest profit from the Jamaican red dirt. So this exploitation leaves countries in the global south, like Jamaica, less able to deal with climate disasters when they happen. They have the worst infrastructures because obviously they've been torn down, as they dig for the minerals. weaker economies and are often unable to borrow the money needed to deal with any kind of climate change when it does occur. So this is just another map and just showing you kind of where, you know, where the red dirt is located. You can see if you put it together, it's probably half the island and the different ports that it is exported from as well. So who is to blame? It's not about blaming individual people, you know, it isn't about blaming you or I or, you know, your next door neighbor about the size of their carbon footprint. As I mentioned earlier, you know, interpersonal or, you know, one-to-one racism isn't really what I'm talking about here. The world's biggest polluters are large multinational companies from the global north. These companies have basically messed up the climate, a mess that the global south is having to deal with, and one that richer countries will increasingly have to deal with going forward. And there's been some research that, you know, identified that 100 companies have contributed to 75% of the world's greenhouse gases since 1988. So just literally 100 companies are responsible for, you know, over 2/3 of the greenhouse gases. Unsurprisingly, most of these companies are run for the profit of stakeholders in the global north as well. Colonialism was motivated by the desire to exploit the global south's people, natural resources, irrespective of damage caused to the lives of the people or the environment. Corporations and governments are still continuing to do this today. But don't think this is just happening across, you know, the other side of the world or what have you. It's happening just here in the UK. The disproportionate impacts of climate crisis aren't just happening far away, as I mentioned. You know, they're happening right here. Lower income communities, Black people, people of color are the ones, again, disproportionately affected. You know, this infographic I've got here is just showing a breakdown. Yes, it's actually it's one based on American stats, but it's very, very similar to England. I couldn't get a picture and I couldn't draw my own one. Black, African and Caribbean people are exposed to higher levels of illegal air pollution than any other group in the UK. The country's worst air pollution levels are seen in neighborhoods where predominantly Black people live. And this is fueling a public health crisis. Air pollution is a contributing factor to several underlying health conditions which Black women suffer from at alarmingly higher rates. And this is causing and is leading to premature, underweight and stillborn babies. We live in the UK, you know, and these things are happening. As I said, blows my mind. People of color in the UK are more likely to live in poor quality housing that's vulnerable to flooding and are less equipped to deal with extreme heat. Just as those in the global south are less equipped to deal with climate change, so are, you know, those of us, you know, in the diaspora also are disproportionately faced by the same problem. So when I say diaspora, I'm talking about dispersed populations with a common origin, background or belief. You know, for example, the Jamaican diaspora in the UK. This is not a coincidence. It is, again, because of structural racism and that people of color, Black people in Europe and North America are more likely to live in bad quality housing in built up areas and to work in industries where they're much more exposed to pollution. And again, when we go back to coronavirus, you know, it was those that were working, you know, on the buses, in the supermarkets, in the healthcare settings, you know, that were dying at much more disproportionate rates. I'm wrapping up, and I think I'm almost to the end. So how do we co-build a new eco-social world where no one is left behind? You know, any social worker knows we are big on talking about co-production, co-creation. Co-building is just an extension of that. While people in the global south are at the front line of climate change, there are also the impacts of climate change, but also the first to resist environmental destruction. Supporting environmental defenders who are people of color is a real way to affect the change of the unequal impact of climate change. For example, Indigenous people live on about 1/4 of the world's land, home to 80% of the world's remaining biodiversity, showing that Indigenous knowledge is a crucial defense against environmental crises like climate change. For thousands of years, people of color have lived in harmony with nature. By practicing sustainable farming and effective fire and waste management techniques, solutions which often are more friendly to the planet than industrial fixes that the West would like to push. Black people, people of color, hold answers to many of the problems of climate change. So it's time that we stop and listen to what these solutions could be. Fundamentally, though, we can't win the fight against climate devastation without dealing with racism. We have to call on our governments and our corporations to tackle the climate emergency urgently. And doing so, help to correct ingrained racial inequalities to create better and more equal societies. Globally, the linkage between climate change and racial justice have not gained the recognition that they should. I know I mentioned that there's been research, but it hasn't been at the pace that I would have liked it to have been. At the level of international climate negotiations, the rate of progress on this front is still too slow. The human rights lens on climate change in the global discussion has only gained limited traction, with some minor progress on the gender and climate change front. In addition to this, systemic racism in climate movement has also results in the marginalization of Black people's expertise, particularly scientists or practitioners, as European perspectives are generally supported, prioritized and magnified. Black climate experts face the additional burden of operating within racist structures while also trying to address climate change. The climate change movement simply does not have a good track record of handling issues of equality, equity, or understanding climate change in a dimension beyond strictly environmental. They're not making the links. They're not, putting two and two together. However, since BLM is bringing much more attention to these issues, we hopefully will see a spur in a positive change, in the direction of positive change. Due to the movement, climate activists around the world are increasing their support for climate change and racial justice. This is a complex issue. There is no quick fix. The task of dismantling systemic institutional racism requires more than superficial gestures, but instead entails assessing, changing, and even eliminating long-standing systems that have led to equality, supporting organizations committed to racial and climate justice, and eradicating policies that marginalize Black people and communities of color are just a few of the widespread changes that need to happen. The time has come for climate change communities to recognize and act upon the racial injustices that increase the risk of climate change for Black people and other communities of color. Climate change can't be racist, can it? Thank you.
Thanks, Chantal.
Have I stopped sharing? I haven't, have I?
Thanks very much, Chantal.
No worries. Over to you, Anna. Right, hold on.
Yeah. If you want to.
One.
Yeah, I think I can share my screen.
I was going to say, yeah, it's asking me to, yeah. You've done that? Perfect.
Great. Well, I think, Chantal, you've done such a brilliant job. I absolutely take my hat off to you, and I'm really grateful for you taking up this this challenge to bring us a presentation about the direct links between racism and climate change. I think you've done a really moving job on that. I've been looking at climate change, climate disaster, whatever you want to call it, from a psychosocial perspective. And a couple of years ago, I got together with the Climate Psychology Alliance and realized the kind of psychological impact of climate change on people. So I've been quite interested in psychosocial view of climate change. And as a social worker working with children and families, I was also aware that it's very easy, isn't it, well, it's not easy, but it's a difficult job doing children and family social work. But, you go into an individual family, you assess their parenting of the children, you don't take good enough account of the environment and the environmental impact of poverty, inequality on their lives. So I thought, what is the point of doing children and family social work if you can't think of the much bigger picture? So I kind of went from a psychoanalytic kind of interest in social work to an ecological interest in social work. So I've kind of done the two extremes, I think, in terms of thinking about unconscious factors, and then environmental factors. So I'm going to talk about ecological social work. And I'm sorry, I should in a different way. But anyway, I thought this, I've written an article in a special issue of the Journal of Social Work Practice. And this quote is by D.H. Lawrence, and I kind of draw on D.H. Lawrence quite a bit. He was writing a long time ago, but he was writing about industrialization, and he wrote very strongly about industrialization and its impact ecologically on the world. And I think this quote reflects the kind of mindset that might be behind some of the destructiveness of the capitalist male patriarchy that is destroying the world, both in war and conflict at the moment. Putin, and which sums up this extractivist kind of mindset that can exploit the world's resources. And what is it that why do people behave like that? So D.H. Lawrence is talking about the way that this kind of machine, this industrial machine, this wonderful machine, it's really satisfying to men, because even whilst it's destroying them, they wanted it. It's it exalts them. They feel superhuman, and they want to feel exalted by belonging to this great and superhuman system, which was beyond feeling or reason. I really kind of thought Putin is summed up by this kind of idea, D.H. Lawrence writings all that time ago. Unfortunately, I'm going to go through a few kind of scary things, but hopefully not leave everybody with just the fear. But we have a new IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, has just produced their 6th report. The latest output is saying that we're in code red for humanity. So basically, this is we have a small window of opportunity to address climate change, and it's absolutely clear that climate change is a human, it's made by human activity, and so there's very, very clear evidence now of what's happened, and it says the climate's changing at an unprecedented rate, and we really need to act urgently. So what does ecological disaster mean? It's on different spheres. It includes global warming, including, like Chantal said, extreme weather events. It includes deforestation and desertification. It includes loss of biodiversity, environmental degradation and pollution. And of course, it means increasing conflict and war and global migration. So, conflict and war over scarce resources. And we could argue that Putin is wanting to secure Ukraine as the breadbasket of Europe, and they're wanting to grab the land and grab the resources, probably uranium and lots of different resources in Ukraine, because he probably knows that that this is coming. So that there's a bun fight for the world's resources, and unfortunately, people have been predicting an increase in conflict and war because of the conflict over scarce resources. The World Health Organization says that climate change impacts on the health, and the people, like Chantal already said, the people whose health has been harmed first and worst by climate crisis are the people who contribute least to its causes. And they're also the least able to protect themselves and their families against it. So the people in low income and disadvantaged countries and communities. And this really hit home to me, really, really painful fact that the climate crisis threatens to undo the last 50 years of progress of development, global health and poverty reduction, and to further widen existing health inequalities between and within populations. Now I was going to do a slide about world migration. It's great, but I haven't got time. But if people wanted to look into this, about I would suggest going to the World Migration Report. It's an excellent resource for looking at these issues. What does it, we're at the Tavistock now, so obviously we're interested in mental health and emotional well-being. What does climate crisis have to do with mental health? Well, the Grantham Institute have just produced a brilliant report talking about the effect on people's mental health. It has a negative effect on people's mental health and emotional well-being around the world. There's a clear relationship between increased temperatures and number of suicides. There's obviously people will be in severe distress following extreme weather events. And so climate change exacerbates mental distress, particularly among young people. And I've kind of sat on a conference recently with Caroline Hickman, who's been writing about and researching eco-anxiety in young people. So I would direct people towards Caroline Hickman's work. I think ecological thinking is extremely important for social work. Why is it important? Well, kind of, I think traditionally we have thought ecologically. We've had Bronfenbrenner, which I always find it difficult to say his name, but it's a good old-fashioned idea, isn't it, that we've got this individual and this family, but within their they sit within the community, and they sit within the community sits within socioeconomic and political world, and so there are different layers that are all interdependent on each other. I think ecology is a realistic approach to seeing the world, which recognizes that humanity and all living organisms are deeply embedded in interdependent relationships, and that where human beings are part of and utterly dependent on healthy and complex ecosystems, and there's nothing more important than the ecosystems that we depend upon. I don't really need to kind of go through this because Chantel's kind of given a great description of what social and racial justice has to do with climate change. And as social workers, we need to have this awareness of the context of the people's lives that people are operating within. And the very good writer about the global climate change social work situation is Lena Dominelli. So I would also direct people to Lena Dominelli's work, and she says basically that social workers will be the ones to pick up be dealing with the people who are experiencing these disasters. Many of you social workers will be dealing with people who've had to migrate due to conflict and war, which is in turn caused by a fight for the world's resources. So I think the ecology and the environment is deeply embedded in social work, the social work task. We also need to promote the values of interdependence and solidarity with those who suffer the most. And I think we need to engage in the complex arguments and realities around climate change so that we can effectively counsel people who are suffering loss and grief and help them to build their resilience. And I just kind of really love Wales. I don't know why, but Wales is a great country, and it's really punching above its weight in terms of ecological thinking, and they brought out an act in 2015 called the Wellbeing of Future Generations Act. So Wales have produced this act, which means that any public services have to think about the impact of the future generations of their decision making. And I think, you know, we could call the government in England to do the same. I just want to end on a kind of kind of a note that is about hopefulness, because we're creating communities and we're connecting with you now. You know, Naomi Klein is a very powerful writer, and she analyzes these things in a very clear-sighted way. And she wrote in The Intercept recently about Putin and his toxic war, and how it was based on a nostalgia and petro-fascism and all of this kind of stuff's brilliant. I thought this stood out, and I just wanted to end here by saying that, you know, the climate justice movement has won very important battles over the last decade, succeeded in banning fracking in all over the world. Huge pipelines have been blocked. Many export terminals and various Arctic drilling forays have been blocked. And these climate justice movements are very much based on Indigenous leadership, which has played a central role in nearly every fight. And, you know, as of this week, 40 trillion worth of endowment, pension and funds, over 1,500 institutions have committed to some form of fossil fuel divestment. So I'm going to kind of stop sharing there and open it up to discussion. I know that we've had people's hands up very quickly, so we will get into a discussion. I don't know if we'll have a kind of question and answer type of forum, or we'll kind of, people will make their points and then we'll get people to have, you know, kind of open up the discussion.
Thanks very much, Anna. That's a very moving paper, and thank you as well, Chantal. They're two very powerful, moving presentations, very thought-provoking.